All right, today we are jumping into a massive battle of ideas. We're going to talk about how the field of sociology, which was once super confident it could find absolute truths about society, came up against a radical new challenger that completely changed the game.
This quote right here, it perfectly captures that old-school scientific mindset, the belief in hard facts, cold evidence, stuff you can actually prove. For a long, long time, this was the guiding light for social sciences, the ideal they were all shooting for.
So that leads us right into our first big idea, this search for social truth. See, in the beginning, the whole mission of sociology was to be a hard science, but for society. The goal? To find universal laws that explain how humans behave. Just like a physicist figures out the laws of gravity. It was a hunt for undeniable social facts.
And this is basically what that looked like in practice. It was all about this clean, straightforward process. You start with people, you apply some kind of variable to one group, you compare them to a control group that didn't get the variable, and bam, you get a clear, measurable result. This was the gold standard for proving cause and effect.
The whole thing was built on the classic scientific method. You select your sample, you collect your data, you analyze it, test your hypotheses, and report what you found. The entire system was designed to be totally airtight, right? To make sure everything was objective, valid, meaning you're actually measuring what you think you are, and reliable.
And what was the result of all this work? Well, you'd get a truth like this one. Just look at that table. A super clear, powerful connection. The more education you have, the more money you're likely to make. It's clean, it's quantifiable, and it really looks like an objective fact about our world, like a social law we just discovered in the data.
But then, just when everything seems so clear and simple, a question pops up. And it's a simple one, but it shakes the entire foundation of this whole approach. If science is all about finding the truth, who exactly gets to decide what truth is to begin with?
And that one question? It basically kicks the door wide open for our challenger, postmodernism. Now, this wasn't just some new theory, it was a full-on attack on the very idea that we can be certain about anything. The most famous definition for it, from the philosopher Jean-François Lyotard, is this amazing phrase, a profound incredulity toward meta-narratives.
So what on earth is a meta-narrative? Well, think of it as a grand narrative. It's a huge, overarching story that claims it can explain everything for everybody. Things like the idea that science will lead to endless progress, or that history is all about the struggle between economic classes. These are the big stories that claim to hold some kind of universal truth.
So what Lyotard was saying is that postmodernism basically says, nope, we're not buying these huge, one-size-fits-all stories anymore. Instead, it focuses on what he called petit récits, or small stories. These are the local, specific truths you find in communities and personal experiences, stories that don't even pretend to speak for the whole world.
And here it is, the heart of the challenge. Postmodernism makes the claim that these so-called universal truths, they aren't universal at all. They're just the stories of one particular culture, usually the dominant one, that have been dressed up to look like objective facts, all to keep the people telling the story in power.
But this critical way of thinking wasn't just aimed at society's big stories. Postmodernism did something really bold. It turned the microscope around and pointed it right at the person holding it, the sociologist. Suddenly, the unquestioned authority of the researcher was now being, questioned. And the claim it made was an absolute bombshell for a field that was built on the idea of objectivity. The researcher is never neutral. You can't just be an invisible, detached observer, because the simple act of doing research changes things.
I love this cartoon because it's a hilarious take on a totally real phenomenon called the Hawthorne effect. The rats think they've got the grad student trained. It's the perfect illustration of this point. When people know you're watching them, their behavior changes. The observer is always part of the experiment.
And the critique went even deeper, questioning the most basic, fundamental tools of science. Take the idea of a random sample. Postmodernism asks, who gets to decide what random even looks like? What kind of unexamined assumptions about class or race or gender are already baked into that decision before you've collected a single piece of data?
And look, we're not just talking about some abstract philosophical debate here. The sources of bias are very, very real. They can be a researcher's own personal beliefs, or the agenda of the company or government agency that's funding the research. And then there's just the simple fact that when you're studying human beings, it's pretty much impossible to be completely free of values.
So you might be thinking, okay, did this just completely wreck sociology? Well, not at all. Instead, the field took this critique on board and it evolved. It stepped into a new reality, one that was way more complex, for sure, but also a whole lot more self-aware.
This was a huge, fundamental shift in how people thought about research. That old-fashioned pursuit of perfect, almost godlike objectivity, that was basically abandoned as an impossible dream. The new goal became something much more realistic and, frankly, more honest, to recognize your biases, to acknowledge them, and to account for them in your work.
So this new way of thinking meant sociologists needed a whole new toolkit. A really key tool is something called reflexivity, which is basically just the practice of looking in the mirror. It means you're constantly asking yourself how your own biases and your own position in society are shaping your research. It also led to new methods, like deconstructing data to find hidden assumptions, and being really open about the power difference that always exists between the researcher and the people being studied.
So what's the big takeaway here? Well, the whole mission kind of changed. For a lot of sociology, the focus shifted away from trying to find that one big truth that explains everything for everyone. Instead, it became much more about understanding and lifting up all the many different smaller stories that actually make up our social world.
And that leaves us with a really fascinating question to think about. By giving up its claim on absolute scientific certainty, did sociology kind of lose its way? Or by embracing all this complexity and admitting its own limits, did it actually find a more honest, maybe even a truer path to understanding who we are?